This week's Device Talks Weekly Podcast is brought to you by Device Talks Tuesdays. Join us on Tuesday at 4 p.m. You'll hear from executives from Locus Robotics, Ambu US, and Stryker about readying your medtech distribution for the future. Go to DeviceTalks.com to register. All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Hey everyone, this is Tom Salemi. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast. As always, I'm joined by my podcast partner, Chris Newmarker, the executive editor of Life Sciences at Mass Device. Mr. Newmarker, how are you today?
Good to be here, Tom. Good to be here.
Chris and I are functioning on a lower energy than we typically do, so we may not be as zany, but we'll be just as lovable, I'm sure, as we typically are on this podcast.
We'll try.
So we have an interesting program today, and it is a serious discussion about healthcare inequity. And I'm going to speak with Camille Chang Gilmore. She's the Vice President of Human Resources and the Global Diversity Officer at Boston Scientific, and Michael Jaff, Dr. Michael Jaff, who's the CMO for the Peripheral Interventions Group at Boston Scientific. He was previously the president at a local hospital, local to me anyway, Newton Wellesley Hospital. And we'll talk about Boston Scientific's Close the Gap program, which was its intent and its very noble objective is to bring attention to the fact that not everyone in this country is getting equitable health care, that people of color and people of fewer means are getting shortchanged in many ways. And it's something that I should have been more aware of, but I wasn't aware of how bad it was. And I'm also embarrassed to say that I didn't know this program has been around since 2006. I thought it was something they were creating to sort of address a lot of the concerns about today. So
right. I know that people in minorities have been definitely hit harder by the pandemic than others. But I guess what's happening with the pandemic is just like reflecting something that has been going on for a long time. So here's to hoping that they can help prove this.
Absolutely.
And I would just add that we're planning to do an article off of this interview for the October edition of Medical Design and Outsourcing. That's our Women in MedTech edition that we do every year, and it's run by our amazing senior editor Danielle Kirsch. But I would say watch out for more article, more content like this in coming weeks as we roll out stuff that we're going to be using in that edition.
Absolutely. Before even going into our highly desired and most listened to, no doubt, featured Newmarker's Newsmakers, where Chris is going to identify the top 5 newsmakers in medtech per our Mass Device page, we're going to share a little conversation, or a bit of a conversation Chris and I had with Jeff Karp. He's the head of the Karp Lab. He's a physician at Brigham Women's Hospital in Boston and the inventor of many, many wonderful things. Chris and I had a chance to speak with him on our Device Talks Tuesday program. And the theme of the conversation was basically overcoming failure and overcoming shortcomings. And the clip we'll run in a minute, Jeff is really open about something he had to overcome as a child, which was a limitation in school. And I know it resonated with many people out there. I've heard from one medtech exec who emailed back and said that was me as well. And many parents out there, I'm sure, will connect as well, because your kids are younger. But when your kids get into school and you're faced with someone telling you that they're falling short in places, it can be very, very troubling. So, and Jeff will tell the story of his mom really stepping up to help him. So, again, as a dad, and you're a dad of younger kids, it was really a great story.
Yeah, it's definitely something any parent could identify with. So it's inspirational to hear what Jeff went through.
And we'll run that clip. We'll just have a very short bit. If you want to hear the rest of it, go to DeviceTalks.com. You can listen to the whole thing for free. And he goes beyond his childhood and talks about how he's operating his lab. And I know a lot of people found it very useful. So let's hear quickly from Jeff Karp, head of the Karp Lab. Happy to be joined by Jeff Karp. Jeff, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on your show.
Really excited to. This is I'm glad we I'm glad we connected. I know you'd spoken at DeviceTalks a couple of years ago before I joined, and you and I connected on LinkedIn, and then it was just like, hey, would you do this? And you said, yes, you would. So it's a real thrill to have you here. And I was equally thrilled by your insistence that we not have a PowerPoint presentation and just have a conversation. So we've got a little bit of a list of things we're going to hit upon. But first, I want to just go over your background a little bit, and we'll talk about it. Well, why don't we just kind of start to review it now? I mean, people can read through the bullet points, see all the things you've done, see the companies you've launched. Your lab has led to technology that has launched several companies, raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And I would like to just this seems like a good point to ask. Was this your life's plan at the beginning? How did you get to be Jeff Karp, the head of Karp Lab? I'm sure when you were a little boy, you dreamed someday I'll have a lab of my own.
I think I think early on I wasn't really good at too many things. I would say I had a lot of dentists in my family, and there were some doctors, and I was very interested in being a doctor. Although I don't think I really knew what it meant to go through medical school and what a doctor's life really entailed kind of day to day. But I was just kind of gravitated towards that. And I think I always wanted to build things, but I didn't really, there really wasn't anyone in my life who was like a builder of things. So I didn't necessarily have like a mentor. And so I had this dream that I was going to build a robot. And I kept, like when there was like kind of paper towel roll ran out, and I took the roll, I threw it in my closet, and I had a whole stash of things there with this dream one day that I was going to build a robot. But I just had no idea what I didn't even know what it was.
What were you going to do with that robot, Jeff? Were you going to conquer the world? Was that the plan?
I don't know. But as I progressed, I started thinking about biomedical type things like engineering and medicine and combining it. And had a number of setbacks along the way. I can happy to talk about those twists and turns. Yeah.
I mean, that is the topic of the conversation, sort of coming back from setbacks. So what's one or two of those that you sort of want to delve into for us?
Yeah, well, I would say, there was a number of key points, I think, in my life where I was struggling a lot. And, one is when I was younger in the second grade, actually, the teacher wanted to hold me back because I just, didn't really, I wasn't at the same level as the other students. Eventually I wasn't held back. I went forward, but I just kept struggling with things, and was pretty much like a C and D student until I got to about the sixth grade. When my mom, who's really, my biggest champion, my big supporter, thought that I should be tested for learning disability, or now it's called learning difference. And I don't know if anyone in my school, I grew up in a small city northeast of Toronto in Canada, and I don't know if anyone had been identified, or there was just few people. So it was not a clear process. And there was a lot of challenges along the way. But eventually I did get identified as having a learning difference. And what that actually did is, and along the way I got some extra help. I used to go to this center called the Gallup Learning Center, and I remember it quite well. And, they would ask me questions, and I would give answers, and they'd say, well, how did you think about that? And it was interesting because that question about how did you think about it, especially so early, made me go into self-reflection and really think about the process that my mind uses to get to certain answers. And that's actually stuck with me to today, and I actually use that every day in my lab. About, when I talk about my lab, people ask, like, what are you focused on? And the answer is actually, we're not focused on anything, because, I really think of the lab as focused on the process of medical problem solving, but as it applies to potentially almost any problem. So there's no disease focus, and there's no technology focus. And I really think, and this really tracks back to this awareness that I was able to start to build early on by people asking me the question of, how did you think about that? Like, how did you get to that answer? And how did and so by learning that process, I was able to kind of hijack that process and develop a lot of coping strategies along the way. And so in grade 7, actually, I had a lot of teachers, depending on how you define the word failure. I mean, I had a lot of teachers, they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a doctor. And they said, well, I don't think you have what it takes. You better set your sights lower. So I countered a lot of resistance. I also recognize, in particular in subjects like math and things, and I actually noticed this quite a bit now with my kids. I have an 11-year-old and a 15-year-old that, when you're asked a specific question, the answer is dependent on how you interpret the question. And there's not a single interpretation, for a lot of questions. And so, by kind of engaging in this awareness process, I was able to really think critically about problems. And again, that, fast track to today, that's one of the things I think that really defines what we do is just how we think about problems and how we think about designing experiments to better understand problems. So if we go back, when I then went into the 7th grade, I had an exceptional teacher, which was really important, and had the support of my parents and my mom, especially was really just incredibly supportive. And I went to and because I was identified through this big push, I was able to get extra time on my exams and my assignments, and that's all I needed. And I went to a straight A student and maintained pretty much straight A's until I got to undergrad. And I still encountered quite a bit of resistance along the way, which helped me to really become my own advocate. Had to battle a number of teachers, and there were some key challenges there.
All right, and we're back. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jeff Karp of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, and of course the Karp Lab. And again, if you want to catch the rest of that conversation, please go to DeviceTalks.com, hit the Device Talks Tuesdays tab, and it will be up there and ready for you to listen on demand. Just register and you can watch it. It's on video. You get to see Chris, me, and Jeff Karp. Now, we still don't have any theme music, Chris. I need to work on that. But everyone, if you could just imagine a drum roll in your head one more time until we can figure out how
I've got an idea. Tom, I've got an idea. You just wait till next week.
Okay.
I'm gonna have something. All
right, people. You heard it. You heard it. Chris has an idea.
I have an idea. We'll see how it goes. All right, but this week's new markers, news makers. So, all right. So number 5, we've got. Let me see if I can pronounce this right. Nanovibronics. Their device gained an FDA nod for importation to the United States. Their device is the EuroShield. And what this is, it's an ultrasound-based system for preventing bacterial colonization and biofilm on indwelling urinary catheters.
We got a lot of attention for the single-use scope podcast we did a couple of weeks ago. You and I both are getting contacted by many companies, and that's been our most listened to podcast out there. So this issue of keeping devices clean and safe is not going to go away. Very important. So solid number 5. All right, Chris, what's number 4?
Solid number 5. Number 4 is a regulatory story. FDA is updating its adverse event database for the manufacturer and user facility device experience database, also known as MAUD. But what they're doing is they're now including new adverse event summaries. So, this should hopefully, they're adding, a data field called the patient problem code. So this should hopefully going forward make it more, clear, why different problems are happening, and help provide more insights about problems that we're having with various devices out there. One open question that we're going to be looking into going forward is for now it remains unclear whether these patient problem codes are going to be also made available for for previous reports, everything from like 1997 to 2019. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how that goes going forward, but at least from now on, we'll have these codes, and they should provide us a clear picture on what's going on.
That's another important topic, and probably conversation for a Device Talks Tuesday in the future.
Yeah.
Good one. All right. Number 3 is a biggie as well. My goodness.
Yeah. Number 3, this one we cribbed off, the Washington Post and linked back to them. The Post had a, article this week about, N95 respirator shortages still a problem. 3M's cranking them out, but we're still just not going to, it looks like it's not going to meet demand as, the fall and winter approaches. And, the big thing the Post cited was just that there's still just a lot of, inter-industry, a lack of inter-industry cooperation on the production. And, unlike with, ventilators, the Trump administration isn't using the Defense Production Act as much with the N95 masks. So, there's still a problem, unfortunately.
Number 2 is probably the best article I've ever read in my entire life. What's number 2, Chris?
Number 2 is this is a feature from me. I wrote this. Thanks, Tom. I'm so glad you like that.
That was
article.
You?
That was me.
I didn't know that.
Well, really, this is like, we've just had like a ton of news in recent months about, surgical robotics companies. Of course, a lot of surgical robotics, took a hit amid the pandemic because, hospitals were just so focused on fighting the virus. But this was a hot area before the pandemic. It's still a hot area. Intuitive Surgical still is the dominant player, but we got like a lot of companies, both big and small, that are doing stuff in this space now. And I put together just a roundup of 12 companies you need to know, and it's just really like I would recommend it as a good primer on just getting the lay of the land of where we are right now. Like we got Intuitive, we got big companies like Medtronic and J&J that are trying to get into the game. You got some interesting stuff going on in ortho robotics with like big companies like Stryker and Smith & Nephew and Zimmer Biomet and Medtronic. They're in the spine space. So, there's J&J too. So, there's a lot going on. So if you want just a good overview of, all the different companies involved and what they're up to at this point, I'd recommend the article. It's 12 surgical robotics companies you need to know.
Fantastic. You did a great job with that one. It is a great overview. All right. Now it's time for number 1.
Number 1 is
of the new markers, newsmakers.
Boston Scientific, they might buy a AFib treatment startup called FairPulse. They signed an investment agreement with them that has an option to acquire. But the interesting thing about FairPulse is that they're working on pulsed field ablation system for treating AFib. This is like kind of creating a therapeutic electric field to treat AFib instead of like kind of like the other like thermal energy source tech like radio frequency ablation or cryoablation that's been out there. So this obviously seems to be like a little bit of a different different approach to to treating AFib, and we'll see where it goes. But Boston Sci obviously has some interest in this.
Excellent. And it's a nice segue into our next segment, Chris. Boston Scientific, as we mentioned up top. We had
Here we go.
Had a conversation actually just earlier this morning on Thursday with Camille Chang Gilmore, Vice President of Human Resources and the Global Diversity Officer at Boston Scientific, and Dr. Michael Jaff, the CMO for Peripheral Interventions, about their very important, very impressive Close the Gap program. So let's kick off this interview with these two very impressive people. Well, Camille Chang Gilmore and Dr. Michael Jaff, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to be with you, Tom.
This is a topic and a problem that I'm sad to say I've been somewhat ignorant of. It's health equity is something or inequity is something you hear about, but the numbers you present with your Close the Gap program are startling and really depressing. So this is probably a good time. I'm going to assume that there are others out there who aren't aware of a wider problem. So let's open up this conversation by just identifying the problem you're trying to address with Boston Scientific's Close the Gap program.
Well, Tom, Close the Gap is not a feel-good initiative. It really is a testament to the mission that underlies everything that we do as a company at Boston Scientific. And ultimately, we are here to improve the healthcare outcomes for all patients around the world. About 15 years ago, we developed this program, and throughout time, what we've been doing is supporting healthcare providers and their centers and practices an effort to really increase the access to care for populations, specifically the Black community, Hispanic community, and women. And just this past year, Boston Scientific strengthened its commitment by really expanding Close the Gap and really investing resources at a time that probably most needed with COVID-19 happening, where we see the heightened awareness and need for programs like this.
This would be, I guess, a nice opportunity to let's talk about the particulars of the program. You addressed it briefly in your answer, but more specifically, how are you addressing this problem through your interactions with providers?
Well, the first thing that we're doing is through education and really looking at ways in which we can provide education to providers to educate them not only about the prevalence of the disease state that resides within their community, but also educating patients on what are the therapies that are available to treat their disease states, like heart failure, atrial fibrillation, or even stroke. We do this by another approach through data. We use our information. We have a repository of data where we can look at a catchment area by zip code of a location in the country and get really specific with even hospital systems and providers and educate them on the diseases that exist locally within their communities so that they can then even reach out directly and make the community aware of what they can do to treat them. And then it really is about partnerships. What we've been doing the last few years is identifying those partnerships that can reach the Black, Hispanic, and women in the community. And partnerships like Black Health Matters, or even working with local hospital systems to really build that trust in the community. Because here's the deal. With COVID-19, I can tell you that there is an erosion of trust. And I think many healthcare providers, many even hospital systems recognize that Close the Gap can really be a part of their post-COVID-19 recovery strategy to really get back into those communities and build that trust to say, hey, we are a resource for you. And more importantly, we want to provide you with the best healthcare.
Where are you seeing that erosion of trust? I agree with the assessment, but I'd love to find out specifically where do you see the system failing in creating this feeling of distrust?
Well, unfortunately, when you look at even just the 400 years of racism and sin that we've been dealing with as a nation, plus coupled with then past sins of failed clinical trials, like what happened in Tuskegee with the Tuskegee trials, clinical trials, where they injected syphilis into Black men and then didn't provide treatment. Those are areas in which the distrust came about. And one of the things I'm so proud of about Boston Scientific is that in 2015, we started our first step in making sure that we built back that trust by creating our own clinical trial called the Platinum Diversity Trial. And, believe it or not, Tom, there was this fallacy that stents reacted different in people of color, Black and Hispanic.
Wow. I'd never heard that, really.
I mean, it was just crazy to think about that. And one of the things that we did is we said, you know what, we've got to prove this wrong. And, we were hit with headwinds like, Blacks won't be compliant if they participate, or Hispanics won't, show up and follow up if they participate in these clinical trials. And not only did we prove that to be just false, we actually proved that not only would they be compliant, they'd be even more compliant. And that at the end of the day, we were enrolling 65 sites, more than 1,500 patients, and it was one of the best clinical trials that we have ever seen with diverse patients. And it's really then heightened the game to say, why don't we have more Blacks, Hispanics, and women in clinical trials? And that's going to be another focus area for Boston Scientific as we go forward to be innovative, is to ensure that we have those constituency groups participate. Does
that circle back to the distrust that certain people don't want to participate in trials because of history? Yeah,
it's history, Tom. Yeah. But then in a lot of ways, they don't even know that the clinical trials even exist. So that's where it's going to take not only educating patients, but also really educating investigators and making sure that not only that we have diverse patients in clinical trials, but we have diverse investigators as well, physicians inviting the community to participate.
Well, Michael, I won't ask you to defend the healthcare provider community, but you've had experience there prior to joining Boston Scientific. You were president of a local hospital in the Boston area, Newton Wellesley, and now I know you're on the board of your local hospital. Can you speak a bit to, I guess, what we're talking about here? We're just the need for education and information, and I guess a reorientation of perspective.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is, Tom, we have tried and failed at diversifying patients' enrollments in major clinical trials. I'm a vascular guy. It's what I've done my whole career. I ran the vascular program at Mass General for many years before going to Newton Wellesley. I sat on the steering committee of federally funded clinical trials where we explicitly said, all right, Tom, in this trial, we're going to get 20% of the population at a minimum to be Black, Hispanic, women, underrepresented minorities. We got 4%. And it's clear to me that one of the big reasons is that if you don't get the doctor who takes care of those patients to participate as investigators in those clinical trials, then the patients aren't going to do it. A, they don't know about it, as Camille said, but B, if their doctor doesn't support it, if they don't feel, empowered to participate and bring cutting edge technologies that could be life or limb saving to them, they're not going to consider it. And so we need to diversify the investigator pool that participates in clinical trials. And I have to tell you, Tom, that goes all the way back to high school. Mm-hmm. We need to recruit more students, kids who are going into the STEM field to think about medicine as a breakthrough way to help us fix this disparity in healthcare. Generally,
how are the clinicians and the investigators generally selected? I mean, I imagine it's in other specialties, it's sort of who you know, it's networks, it's old, it's just kind of a circular rehashing of the same network of folks.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, you have to have some degree of infrastructure to participate in a clinical trial, right? You have to have an investigative review board that's sanctioned by the Food and Drug Administration to review the trial and make sure that it's ethical, so things like Tuskegee never happen again. You have to have research coordinators whose job is largely to enroll the patients, provide the follow-up for the patients, stay in contact with the patients. This is not only a skill that you need training in, but it's overhead to the doctor's practice. And if that doesn't exist, and by the way, COVID doesn't make this any easier, right? Money is tighter in healthcare, not looser. It's going to be that much harder. But you're right, Tom. Ultimately, it's the same network. You see the same investigators who participate in trials because they have an engine that they've got to support. And the more clinical trials they do, the more people they can support. So we need to figure out a way to incentivize physicians who manage large populations of underrepresented minorities to want to break through this, to be able to develop the infrastructure, get the skills, and get their patients to believe that this is good for their health.
Is there an opportunity to assist those hospitals that perhaps don't have those engines in place, but do serve those communities you're trying to reach to help them build their own engines and become part of this network?
I think what we can do is we can educate and raise awareness of this problem, and that's what this Close the Gap, one of the things we're trying to do. There are obviously guardrails. There are certain things that manufacturers of devices that sell to hospitals can't do, right? Because then it's undue influence. But certainly being at the table, having the dialogue, raising awareness, talking to physicians who practice in the Mississippi Delta or in Shreveport, Louisiana, or Savannah, Georgia, these places where the prevalence of artery disease in the legs, the heart, the brain is out of control. And the outcomes are so terrible. To get those physicians to see the opportunity to turn this tide, that's our opportunity.
Camille, what is the response from folks within Boston Scientific to this program? I'm sure they're supportive of its intent, but to Michael's point, and beyond that, I mean, a device company is selling something to a hospital. It sees a physician as a customer. Your leverage isn't that great. I mean, they could say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to go use someone else's thing. How does that fit into your relationship with clinicians?
I get that question all the time. And one of the things that I can tell you is that when we do talk to a hospital system, I think they find it ironic that we have closed the gap and it costs them nothing. Mm-hmm. We're doing this because we know it's the right thing to do. But in the end, it goes back to our core values, which is making sure that we're serving all patients. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to do is to elevate our game in showing that we can complement the strategy of education we just even recently created some BSC campaigns. And one of the things that we wanted to do to make hospital systems aware that, hey, they can partner with us, close the gap to bring about education, but then we'll complement it through visual diversity. So we recently just started a campaign. We're having like real people, real images, people that live, that could reflect the population that is where the hospital system is. And we created a campaign that's aimed at really making these resources available and offer a specific pathway for healthcare providers to take actions and to fight the health equity. We've been doing it through kind of a multi-channel campaign where we have not only interventional cardiologists, electrophysiologists, and even administrators. But one of the things that we've made them aware of is that this is not essentially about Boston Scientific products. If we happen to sell them, fantastic. But that is not the primary motive for doing this. And we recognize that there are certain markets where the hospital systems can have impact, like Dallas, Detroit, New Orleans, and Minneapolis, especially with what just happened with the death of George Floyd, making them aware that they can use and leverage Close the Gap to have that reach and to really, be that voice to say, not only is this about addressing the healthcare disparities, but also the systemic failure and empathy failure that has existed within healthcare for years. And by bringing visibility to it and not being apologetic for it, I think we're bringing a level of consciousness that, hey, you have Black, Hispanic, and women in your community that are not being served, and Close the Gap can help you serve them through education, by helping you identify them for clinical trials, as well as identifying the partnerships that we can use to reach them even further.
Tom, one of the things we've got statistics on our side, unfortunately, right? Aside from all the things that you've heard, September is Peripheral Artery Disease Awareness Month, which is artery blockage in the legs. And my whole career has been spent educating the public on PAD. But the truth of the matter is underrepresented minorities, and particularly Black populations in the Southeast and Southern Delta area of the United States, has epidemic rates of diabetes and peripheral artery disease. Their rates of losing limbs without even being considered for treatment to save their limb happens in exponentially high rates compared to white, similar age counterparts. And so this is really a crisis that unfortunately COVID has exposed even worse, right? So COVID has shown that at least twice the population that are Black or underrepresented minorities suffer from COVID and serious complications of COVID than their white counterparts. Counties in America that are just overwrought by this, and it's not going to get better. The economic impact to those communities is overwhelming. So it's become now something where we just have to deal with once and for all. And healthcare inequities just makes that easier for us to talk about from a statistics standpoint.
And Dr. Jaff, I'll just add to those stats. Unfortunately, the facts are this. Hispanics represent 18% of the population, but are in less than 1% of clinical trials. Fact. Blacks represent 12% of the population. I have the highest rate of heart disease, but are in less than 5% of clinical trials. And fact, women wait 30% longer to seek medical care than male counterparts. This is the answer to trying to address it. Is it the one and only answer? Probably not, but it's definitely a start.
I guess that's my question. When I first learned of this program, I thought it was timely and necessary, especially with all that's happened. And then I was surprised actually to learn that it's been around since 2006. So I guess my question to you is this approach working, or are we going to be seeing a renewed vigor to this given all with COVID and the killing of George Floyd? Is this a new effort that you think will move us to a point where we haven't yet gone?
Tom, I think it will move us. One of the steady and slow wins the race. And one of the things that the team has always heard me say in my bigger role not with just health equity, but all things community and diversity and inclusion, is that this is going to take progress over time, not overnight. And you've got to be willing to put in the work over time to ensure that it moves from continuous improvement to sustainability and then industry leadership. And I think we're headed toward industry leadership with Close the Gap. We're showing that we're in this for the long haul because of even when we started the program. I mean, this was started when it wasn't sexy to do this, and when we saw the need and said, you know what, we're going to hit it on head on and not be apologetic for it. And look at where the world has taken us today. Who would have thought that Close the Gap could be that integral part of a post-COVID-19 recovery strategy? Who would have thought? For anyone, whether it's a hospital system, whether even a healthcare provider, or even a patient. But it is. And I think what we're recognizing is that our methodical approach has worked well. Initially we were going to churches. We were doing the grassroots kind of things, going to churches, going to barbershops. And then we realized, you know what, there's a trust element there. They trust the pastor. They trust the barber. They may not trust Boston Scientific. So how do we build that? Trial and error. We had to figure it out. But we just couldn't show up at the barbershop and say, hey, we're Boston Scientific. We want to help you with your heart disease.
I don't know why. That's a great point. But I guess this is, and I'm sorry, I'm having trouble articulating my question, but I have two more.
Okay.
Number one, since the killing of George Floyd and over the summer, we've had a lot of statements from other medtech companies about their support for diversity, and I think it was largely seen as more of maybe of an employment, just a personal treatment issue, and less so. I've had it raised once before, the inequity of healthcare, but there are all of your colleagues and competitors have taken public stands to push equity forward, to be at the forefront of it. Are you seeing other programs out there? Are you reaching out to other parts of industry? Because it seemed like this would be most effective if you're all rowing in the same direction.
I haven't reached out, but I've had others that have reached in, right? And asked us, how did we get this started and how did we do this? I have to say, one of the proudest moments of my career at Boston Scientific was when our CEO, Mike Mahoney, and the executive committee created an open letter and wrote that 2 days after George Floyd's death. And not only wrote a letter that created a stance as far as where we stood regarding racism, but also made a commitment to $2.5 million post that to say we will play our part to combat racism. We know, like I mentioned, it's a 400-year-old sin. We're not going to, tackle it tomorrow. It's going to take some time.
Mm-hmm.
But, one of the things is we put our money where our mouth is, but more importantly, our actions were to meet those. And, I mentioned to someone the other day, I said, the one thing I love about Boston Scientific is we listen, we learn, and we act. That's just what we do. And we've done that and evolved Close the Gap, not only from a cardiovascular program to peripheral to also even colorectal cancer. And we're even looking to expand it to another division, which is neuromodulation, because we recognize that we need to go after those patients in all those areas, those disease states, and make them aware of what's possible.
Would this be more effective if other medtechs were developing similar programs?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think, there is power in numbers, right? So if there were other medtech organizations that wanted to create something, they should. But, I was on a panel the other day, a MedTech women panel, and one of the representatives from one of the MedTech companies mentioned that they tried this, but it didn't take off in their organization. And they had a lot of resistance because of, one, lack of education, understanding about the constituency groups. And it takes a while to do that. One of the things that we actually did and had to step back is understand the constituency groups in which we're trying to reach. When we're going to Black women and Black men, what do they want? When we go to Hispanic men and women, what do they need and want? When we go to white women, what are they looking for when it comes to therapy, and what do they trust? Again, this all goes back to trust. And we actually took the time to do research on each constituency group just so that we could understand how should we meet them? How should we approach them? And what is the best way that we can even instruct the hospitals and physicians to do that? We also even, as a company, launched unconscious bias training that was required for all our employees and is part of their learning plan. And you would be surprised as to how many people are not aware of the unconscious behaviors or the microaggressive behaviors that they are putting out there and not even know it. And I think that's also part of it, the education. How do we make sure that patients or physicians understand how to even approach the various constituency groups?
Right. And just final quick question. I know you need to go, but in looking at your documents of the reasons listed for people not seeking care, I think number one on 3 out of the 4 conditions you're targeting was cost of healthcare or insurance. Is that really the underlying problem, an overall problem that needs to be addressed? I know that's not something Boston Scientific can handle, but where does the lack of insurance, how much of a role does it play in all of this?
You know, Tom, I struggled with this throughout my career as a practicing doc and then a hospital administrator. There's just no doubt in my mind that because in many situations in the United States, one illness wipes out any residual savings that a family has. They make choices between the prescription medications that they have to fill and their rent and food and car payments and heat payments that they have to make. Those are crises. And, you know, you can argue which healthcare policy is the most effective, but at the end of the day, for a country this great, to have people have to worry about choosing between their healthcare and the food they put on the table, that in and of itself shows you that this is a major issue facing the United States. And that fear keeps people away from the doctor.
Great point. Well, thank you both for your time and for shining a light on this and for leaning in and trying to identify and create a solution. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Tom, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, I learned a lot from that conversation. I hope you all did as well. It's a very important issue that Boston Scientific is stepping up to try to shine some light on and to provide some answers for. And seems like it would be a good opportunity for other medtech organizations, if they're not already doing so, to follow up. Because that's one thing. At the end, we talked a bit about the role of insurance in people or the cost of healthcare being something keeping people away from care. And that was something that Nadeem Yared brought up on a podcast interview a couple months ago, that when we talk about healthcare equality and when we talk about just equality for everyone, that access to healthcare is a very important issue. And it's something that I think we need to find a way to address.
Well, it's literally a matter of life and death. I mean, it's not access to the Jelly of the Month Club here. It's, this is important stuff.
And once again, COVID has shined a black light on that as well. So
on that happy note,
well, it's important work that needs to be done, and we're happy to bring some attention to it, and it's certainly something we'll follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that. I mean, one of the things I've always been really proud of is that my dad was in a anti-poverty protest at the National Mall in '68 that MLK was organizing before he was assassinated. But I mean, here we are decades later, and we're still grappling with all these types of issues. But I mean, hopefully we're doing some good here with highlighting more about what needs to be done in healthcare.
That's a great point. I was to that point, and then we'll move on. I was doing some research on this, and I came upon some reports written on this very topic, and they were from the 70s and the 60s. And you're like,
this is crazy.
Oh my gosh.
We're talking about the same things our parents were talking about when they were our age. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, well, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast. Once again, if you want to hear more from Jeff Karp, go to DeviceTalks.com. You can find the DeviceTalks Tuesdays tab. You can just sign up and watch that whole interview for free. Really, really great stuff from Jeff Karp. And don't forget, this coming Tuesday, we have another DeviceTalks Tuesday called Readying Your Medtech Distribution for the Future, about the future challenges of basically distributing your medical devices. We'll have executives from Locus Robotics, Stryker, and Ambu US. In fact, Steve Block, who was on the podcast just a few weeks ago, will be on that panel as well to talk about how Ambu has worked to overcome any sort of challenges and difficulties in distributing its products during the COVID era. So that's it, Chris. How can folks find you on social media?
Hey, you can find me on LinkedIn, Chris Newmarker, just like a new marker, and you can find me on Twitter at Newmarker, but always happy to talk.
Awesome. And I am also on LinkedIn, Tom Salemi. I am on Twitter at MedTechTom. We would very much love to connect with any of you and all of you. We'd love it if you would share this podcast on Twitter, on LinkedIn. And if you do so, please tag Chris and myself. We'd love to be part of that conversation. Also, please do tell your friends if you're enjoying this podcast. Let them know that we're out there and that we're talking about MedTech. And finally, please do subscribe. That way you'll get this podcast sent directly to you. By the time we post this on LinkedIn and post it up on Mass Device, we've already had several hundred people listen to it. So might as well be one of those first come, first served types of folks. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast. That's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in on this episode of the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast.
Catch you next week.
That works.
That's a wrap.